What is up, YouTubers? One Millsy, back with Hometown Commander, back for another episode of Millsy Brews, the show where I brew version 1.0 deck list of the Commander in front of us on my quest out brew a magic world. As always, the deck list is going to be down in the description below. So I'd really appreciate it if you could interact with the video, like, comment, subscribe, consider checking out the links down in the description. I'd really appreciate it. Today, we're finishing up week 2 of Foundations content. And Tinybones is back. So let's talk about him. Tinybones, a Bauble Burgler, as a 2-mana black skeleton rogue. It says whenever our opponent discards a card, we're going to exile it from their graveyard with a stash counter on it. During our turn, we can play cards we don't own with stash counters on them from exile and spend mana of any type. And for 4 mana, we can tap him to each opponent to discard a card. I appreciate the Tinybones is always stuck on the same thing, caring about our opponent discarding cards and doing things when they discard or forcing them to discard. I think Tinybones, this one to me is the best one yet, mainly because I think this theft style is actually really important. In the past, we're forced to use things like Turgid to have a top end to our discard to start stealing things that way. What I like about this is, man, it is going to allow Tinybones to play them anytime it's out. If they remove Tinybones, Tinybones could come back and still play those things with stash counters on them, and we can still profit from them, and we can still use them. And I think that's the best part about this card, is that if Tinybones is out and think people, discard cards, they get exiled with stash counters, and they destroy Tinybones, we can bring them back, still cast the things that are in exile, and that. This is not going to be the most robust of of episodes as far as our presentation or playtest goes, because to be 100% honest, a lot of our deck is forcing ways to discard and then trying to profit from our opponent's discarding other than getting their cards. And then the rest of the game plan is going to be, what do we hit off of the discards? What are the things that we steal? What are the things that we can steal? It's hard to replicate that a little bit, so I just want to warn you that, like, I can't give you 10 turns of, oh, my opponent discards this, so I play that. What we could try to do in both our presentation and in our playtest today is talk about our approach, how we're going to try to force the discards, and then leave room open, right, to play those things. So as far as forcing discard, there's a lot of ways to do this, and I think there's a lot of cards we have access to. Leon, Waker of the Dead for +1 forces each player to pitch a card, and each opponent who can't loses 3 life. Has some other abilities, but that's the main one. Making sure we're doing that each turn. Aklazotz, whenever it attacks, each opponent discards a card. For each who can't, we draw a card. Whenever they pitch a land that way, we make a 1/1 bat, and whenever it dies, we return it back as a land. But again, the point is that on attack, everybody's forcing a discard once. Cunning Lithomancer, beginning of our upkeep, each player discards cards, so we're in that too. We have to pitch a card as well, but that's okay, because we do actually have cards we're going to talk about on the next section that care about us discarding as well, so that's fine. Whenever Hypnotic Spectre deals combat damage to an opponent, or any damage to an opponent, that opponent discards a card at random. So here's a way to get some discard out of our opponent's hand. Liliana, Heretical Healer. On the front side's a 2/3 with lifelink. Whenever another non-token creature we control dies, we get to flip it, and we make a token to go along with it. And on the backside, we could pay 2 to force each player to pitch a card, but then we can -X to bring a creature back. And that's kind of not a bad reason we don't mind pitching cards to these cards, is because then we can reanimate them or get them back for free, right? And I think that's important, that we're getting value back from us discarding and not just us discarding being viewed as a downside. Necrogoyf is a star forward stars, the number of creature cards in all players' graveyards. During each player's upkeep, that player discards a card, so we have to do that too. But I don't think we mind that at all. We can madness it out with its madness ability, but otherwise, again, forcing more discard, and when they can stack up, it's even better. Rankle comes in as a hasty 3/3 in the air, and that when it deals damage to a player, we get to choose any number that we want. Each player pitches one, each player loses a life and draws, or each player sacrifices a creature. Rankle's great because it can force a lot of things on our opponents, at minimum just pitching a card, otherwise more value than that. We got Rottenmouth Viper there in Bloomborough, which is an interesting one. Additional cost to cast it. We could sack a number of non-land permanents, and it costs 1 less for each permanent sacrificed this way. It says whenever it enters or attacks, you put a blight counter on it, and for each blight counter on it, your opponent gets the choice of losing 4 life unless they sack a permanent or discard a card. This is kind of this Torment of Hailfire style ability, and we love it because we will happily force that on our opponents and give that a lot of bad choices to deal with. Awaken the Erstwhile forces all our opponents to pitch their hands, just like we have to, and then each player makes that many 2/2 zombies. Again, our opponents don't have their cards go to the graveyard with Tinybones outright, but they all go into exile for us to be able to play. Chain of Smog's kind of fun. Target player discards 2 cards from their hand, then that player may choose to copy this and choose a new target. Again, we don't mind if somebody hits us because we can hopefully get in another opponent, get more cards right into exile with stash counters on them. Dark Deal, each player discards all the cards in their hand and then draws that many -1. So a way to get a bunch of cards again in this kind of reverse. And here's a wheel that actually benefits us, right? Getting all those cards into exile with stash counters on them. Death Cloud and Doomsday Confluence are both X spells that can do fun things. Death Cloud says each player loses X life, discards X cards, sacrifices X creatures, and then sacrifices X lands. This is a good way to just potentially wipe a board, force a bunch of things on our opponents, force them to deal with this spell getting rid of a lot of their things. We don't want to do this willy-nilly because it's going to end up hurting us as well. So we kind of want to only do it when we feel like we're far enough ahead that this sacrificing isn't going to hurt what we're trying to do. I like Doomsday Confluence a little bit better. We choose X, and we can choose the same mode more than once. Each player sacrifices an artifact creature, make a Dalek, and then everybody discards a card except us. I kind of like the fact that it's everybody except us, but again, still good value. Mind Twist is a good targeted. Target player discards X cards at random, and if they don't have enough cards, they discard their hand instead. A good way to just get after someone specifically if you know they may have things that you want. Pox says that each player loses 1/3 of their life, discards 1/3 of their cards, sacrifices 1/3 of their creatures. It sacrifices 1/3 of their lands rounded up each time. Again, a good way to affect everyone. It's going to hurt us as well, but we don't mind it as long as we're getting good value off of the things that people are pitching and getting exiled with Tinybones. Rankle's Prank, each player discards 2, each player loses 4, each player sacrifices 2 creatures. We can choose which of them we want. Again, more discard. And then Oppression. Whenever a player casts a spell, that player pitches a card. So another way to get value off our opponents trying to do their own things. So we'll move from forcing the discard to getting value off the discard. Bone Miser says whenever we pitch a creature, we make a zombie. Whenever we pitch a land, we get double black. And whenever we pitch a non-land, non-creature card, we draw a card. So this is so that we can still benefit from the things that force us to discard too. Felspector says that whenever an opponent discards a card, that player loses 2 life. Here's punishing our opponents with some damage for them pitching. Sir Conrad the Grim kind of helps us in a lot of ways. Whenever a creature dies, whenever a creature is put in the graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves our graveyard, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So if creatures are dying and hitting the graveyard, we're dealing damage. If creatures are being discarded and we don't have Tinybones out, it's still going to deal damage. And then Conrad does have the option to mill every player a card if we want to, but I think Conrad, 2 out of his 3 abilities do help us, so we still like it, especially when Tinybones isn't out, forcing the things to go into exile. Of course, we're playing Turgid. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't. Turgid says whenever your opponent sacrifices a permanent or discards a permanent, you can put it on from the graveyard on the battlefield under your control. You can notice that Turgid's a slight non-bow with Tinybones, right? Because Tinybones is going to exile it instead. So if Tinybones is out, Turgid's only going to work when opponents sacrifice things. But if Tinybones isn't out, Turgid is a value engine by its own that's going to help us out. The Raven Man says at the beginning of each end step, but if a player discarded a card, we get a black bird token. So that's not bad, because we're going to have a lot of ways to force everybody to discard, hopefully on everyone's turn. Here we have our first of the Tinybones. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent discarded a card this turn, we draw a card and lose a life. We could pay 6 to deal 10, or have anybody who doesn't have cards in their hand lose 10 life. This is why I think the new Tinybones is just a little bit better, because we're getting that theft off of it, but I think the regular Tinybones fits our deck really well. Bandit's Talent can come in and force each opponent to pitch 2 cards unless they pitch a non-land card. We can tick it up to have a player lose 2 life at the start of their turn if they don't have more than 1 card in their hand. And then we can pitch up to level 3 to draw extra 1 on each of our turns for each opponent that has 1 or fewer cards in their hand. It's not as sexy as I think it is in a 1v1 game in a standard, but I still think it's helpful. Having everybody pitch 2 for 2 mana is still well worth the cost. And then if we can get the upside, we get the upside. Blood Chief's Ascension is another one of these things that's going to punish our opponents, hopefully, for putting a card into their own graveyard, basically discarding or something dying. Beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, we put a counter on it. And then whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, if it has 3 or more counters on it, that player loses 2 and we gain 2. Now, this is a slight non-bo with Tinybones, because remember, Tinybones puts it in exile instead. So it's not going to trigger the Ascension. But I think it's important to still play for the world that Tinybones may get removed off the battlefield. And if it does, we need our discard deck to still function even if Tinybones isn't there. And I think that's why there's the importance of having some of these effects. Dying to Serve says whenever we pitch 1 or more cards, we make a zombie. So there's another way to profit ourselves if we're pitching things. Liliana's Crest and Megrim both deal damage to an opponent whenever they pitch discard a card. And then Waste Not, kind of the opposite of Bone Miser. Whenever an opponent discards a creature, we make a zombie. Whenever they discard a land, we make double black. Whenever they discard a non-creature non-land, we draw a card. Again, I think it's important to say that if Tinybone gets removed off the battlefield, we still want to force our opponent's discards. We can still profit from it. We just don't get to thieve the things. And I think it'd be really easy to say, well, if things like Turgid are non-bows with Tinybones, so I'm just not going to play them. I just don't think it's smart. I think it makes sense to plan for all the scenarios where someone may remove Tinybones and it may not be there. We still want to make this discard train happen. We could still gain profit from it. We could still potentially win the game without Tinybones on the battlefield. I think it gets easier to win the game when Tinybones is on the battlefield. But hey, I think the point is that we have to play the spread. And so in order to do that, we want to make sure that we have all of these pieces. But I've said it before and I'll say it again. No deck's ever complete. This is my version 1.0 shot at this Tinybones. I think there's not a lot of things to be learned in testing. The reason 2 of the 3 cards of the screen are up here is basically just the cost of them. Liliana on the left, I think, is a great card. It's a Planeswalker that can +1 to force each player to discard a card. This is a great ability, but Liliana's sitting at about $20 at the moment, and there are other ways to make people pitch a card for less than $20 and 3 mana. But I think Liliana is a fun adder piece to what you would expect from a discard deck. She can also force somebody to sack a creature. And then the -6 is just a brutal way to wipe somebody's board. Again, I like Liliana the Veil, but I just don't know if it makes sense with how much of the cheaper ways there are to do things. The card in the middle, I think, is the card that everybody's going to expect to be obvious in a deck like this, Shieldred the Apocalypse. A 4-mana creature that says whenever we draw a card, we gain 2 life. Whenever our opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. Way to chip in some damage. I love Shieldred. I'd love Shieldred to be in this deck, but it currently sits about $85, and I just can't justify it. It doesn't actually pay off the discards, and I think $85 is not well spent on Shieldred. If you have a Shieldred, I think it's well worth it in the deck, but I don't see it for this deck, but I could see people wanting it in here. And then Phyrexian Reclamation, I just think would feel right, paying mana and some life to get a creature from our graveyard back to our hand if we discarded it or if it died. I think it probably makes sense to come back in. I just couldn't find the slot for it, but I think it would feel right to do and have access to. Well, let's get into our playtest. Remember, we're going to focus more on getting ourselves set up and getting the discard to happen, and a lot less about going down the rabbit hole of what our opponents could discard. 2-lander with Reanimate, Night's Whisper for some draw, Read the Bones for some draw, and then Necrogoyf. So a 3-lander with Necrogoyf and 2 ways to draw. So not bad. I'll save the Bojuka Bog because there's kind of no reason to do it quite yet. Pay 2. I don't have any way yet to make people pitch, do I? I think Tinybones is probably still worth it. Get it down, get the process started. Oh, Wintermoon is great. A little bit of stacks for our opponents. Players can't untap more than 1 non-basic lander in their upkeep. We're going to try to play as many basics as we can so we don't have to worry about that. So I could play Bubbling Murk till end of turn. Whenever a player taps a swamp for mana, it produces an additional black. That could get me Wintermoon and a Night's Whisper if I wanted to do that. Or I could just Read the Bones or Night's Whisper. But my thing is, like, then I'll have to pitch cards. I don't know that I want to do that quite yet. My thought about this is I can Wintermoon into Night's Whisper, draw 2, lose 2. Now Wintermoon can start hurting our opponents, and we're still in good shape. Remember that it's only when an opponent discards a card that Tinybones goes off, so our things are just going to keep going to the graveyard. We'll get the Gaia Reach in. Remember, it untap up to 1 during our uptap, so non-basic, so our swamps are fine, but 4 mana feels like a nice spot to be. We got something like Snuff Out. If we control a swamp, we can pay 4 life and destroy a non-black creature. Smallpox, he probably loses 1, pitches 1, sacks a creature, and and sacks land. I don't know that we want to do that quite yet. I love the idea of trying to pitch Necrogoyf so that we could play off the madness. But I think it's just read the bones, scry 2, and then draw 2. I actually like both of these. Good way to force some discard. Good way to force some discard. I like it. We have 1 mana left. I guess we have that reanimate up. I guess tactically we could have pitched something like Necrogoyf, right? And then reanimated it back. But I'd say, okay, we didn't get that far ahead. We'll come back to our turn. Play the Bajuka Bog just so that way we can start having another black source. We got to untap the Sanitarium because of the Winter Moon. Each player pitches 2. This could get us to put the Necrogoyf in our graveyard and then reanimate it, right? I don't really hate that idea. We'll pitch the Smallpox and we'll pitch the Necrogoyf. And it's put some cards for our opponents into play. I guess we could have everybody lose 4, but I'm really not that interested in it. Really, there's the discard, right? To get cards into exile now that we have access to them. Coming back to our turn, I kind of want that. We'll untap the Bajuka Bog. I kind of want that Necrogoyf back, so we'll go get it back. Lose a little bit of life for it, but that's a-okay. 3 mana left. We have either the Oppression or the Phyrexian Arena. We'll do the Oppression to force people to discard some more. Necrogoyf's power is equal to creatures in all graveyards. We don't have any at the moment, but our opponents might here in a few turns. And I think now in this turn, I'm untapping a land again. Maybe we start looking at what our opponents have in their hands. You know, if there's something we want to get from, or what they've exiled. If there's something that they have that we want to play that's exiled, we play it. Otherwise, we just continue setting up, right? Maybe we play something like Phyrexian Arena here to get some more draws. We could play the Caress to start getting some life when they have to pay for Oppression, right? We have Snuff Out as an option. We have Defile as an option for some removal. So it could just be Liliana's Caress here. Maybe we have something else to play, but if not, just hold up the removal and just continue to let this train keep exiling cards and getting more access to us in exile that we could play. I hate having that be the end of the playtest, but the truth is, without knowing what our opponents are discarding, right, it's tough to make those decisions. And I think that's okay. The point is we're still figuring out how to set up our things. Keeping a 4-lander, with Jet Medallion, Phyrexian Arena for some draw, and that Bubbling Murk. So I like this one. We draw Necrogoyf turn 1. Play the Lockthwain in tapped. Turn 2, we'll play the Jet Medallion. It would make sense to play Tinybones, but I don't really have any way to discard quite yet. So I don't feel like I need to do that. Mainly just because we can actually Phyrexian Arena and Tinybones this turn. So now we can, get access to more cards, get the train running. We're going to draw an extra card, lose a life for it. 4 mana. Raven Man 1, Liliana's 3. That could be fun. Raven Man for 1, Liliana for 3. Tick up Liliana to force everybody to pitch a card, and each opponent can't loses 3 life. That means on end step, the Raven Man will make us that bird token, right? Now we potentially have access, right, to a couple things in exile now. Come back to our turn, play the Swamp, looking if there's something in anybody's hands to do. Otherwise, we could always just tick up Liliana and have them do it again, right? Add some more things to our pile if they're permanents. Love the idea of something like Shieldred, the other Shieldred. Comes in, forces each opponent to sacrifice a non-token creature. So it's not a bad option. We could Bubbling Murk, would give us 8 mana. Shieldred would be 4, and Necrogoyf would be 4. That could be fun, right? So we already played our land, Bubbling Wire, go Shieldred into Necrogoyf. Everybody's pitched ones. We're going to get another bird. And now everybody has to sacrifice one. Maybe we get a good attack in here with a couple of our creatures. But again, the point is we're setting up a really good board state. Phyrexian Arena back on our turn. And now I think we would just look to see what people have discarded, right? We've done it at least 2 times. We can do it again here with Liliana for a 3rd time. Probably a lot in exile we can play. We've got a good setup right here. We're going to be getting birds every turn because of that Liliana. We have Mutilate for a board wipe in case somebody wipes our board. Necrogoyf will hopefully keep getting bigger. Remember, on their turns, they were pitching things now because of Necrogoyf, so there's more things there. And I think this is where our game plan would kind of open up, having access to things, being able to pitch things, and getting value. But let me know, what do you think of Tinybones down in the comment section below? Again, I'd love to play test, or show you more functioning in a playtest, but I think it's really going to come down to what our opponents pitch. But again, I think the hope here is get enough discards where we can get a good access of things into exile to thieve them, make them for our benefit, and use them against them. But let me know what you think of Tinybones, and I will catch you guys next time.